On this edition of ITG, more changes coming to the college football playoff as the Big Ten and the SEC flex their muscle. We'll get into all of that, as well as an exciting coaching hire for the Mountaineers on this edition of In the Gun.
You are now watching Believe.
ITG.
With Wes, Owen, and Jed.
I've got the best teammates in the business.
No way!
They both played the game. They both know the game. Owen is the runaway beer truck known for having some fun.
Owen Schmidt, you have a podcast In the Gun.
Owen Schmidt, like a runaway beer truck down the sidelines.
Jed is the signal caller who is the X's and O's and the brainiac.
Statistically, always punting on fourth down makes no sense.
So we've combined those two skill sets.
Skills I've acquired over a very long career.
You are In the Gun.
Once you enter this family, there's no getting out.
In the Gun, episode 231 of your new favorite WVU football podcast. I'm Wes Schuler with the best teammates in the business. Got the signal caller, Jed Drenning, as we rock and we roll here on this edition of ITG. And as always, we're brought to you in part by our friends at BetOnline. The game starts here. We will have, it sounds like, very significant changes once again coming to the college football playoff after just the first year of the 12-team expanded playoff. More change imminent on the horizon. We will get into that in just a few minutes. But first, some headlines, as always, to get us started. And Jed, I don't know if you can come up with a bigger headline than this. Welcome home to perhaps the most iconic player in WVU football history. Pat White, former Mountaineer quarterback, of course, is now back with the program as the assistant quarterback coach and assistant to the head coach. This was announced officially last week. This was all the news last week. Obviously, this is the first time we're recording since this announcement has happened, and we're not going to do a deep dive into this right now. Obviously, Owen is going to have a lot to say on his former teammate being back with the program. We will have a lengthier conversation with Big O here soon. We will have Pat, we're hoping, on the show here as well after he gets settled there in Morgantown a little bit. But Jed, I mean, like I said, you want to move the needle. This is about as moving the needle as you can get when you bring somebody as legendary as Pat White as number 5 back to the program in an official capacity.
Without question. You mentioned it, Wes. This broke last week. We had so many discussions leading up to it as it became imminent. Do we put something in the can and drop it right away? What do we do here? And what ended up happening was the vibe. We all agreed. We couldn't pin each other down. We obviously wanted Owen to be part of it. We discussed an immediate reaction episode, but Owen was tied up, and we just thought, without Big O, what's the point of an immediate reaction for Pat White, right? So here we are a week later. Like you said, we're not going to do a deep dive. We just wanted to, at least it's in the news, and it will be in the news probably through the spring and into the summer, the fact that Pat's back. I was in the building, bumped into him outside the offensive meeting room in the hallway. We exchanged a hug, said we'll be spending time together. I'm fired up. He was fired up. He's very happy. Right away, you could tell, obviously, very happy to be back. Pat's excited to be back. He's eager to get rolling. He's already knee-deep in some of his responsibilities. So now that we have Noel back, now that we have Pat back, boy, some of that former magic is starting to be recaptured. And there are certain types of guys that just – their personality is the type of personality that you want within your building. And good move by Rich to get Pat back, because that's the kind of infectious personality that Pat's going to bring, and he's going to bring a lot of value. And for that matter, when kids are on campus, those are two names, Noel Devine and Pat White, that still carry weight even to high school age kids today, in part because of the video games, right? But the truth of the matter is, I'm terribly excited to have Pat back. Now, we will have, if I had to think about this, 4 different coaches on some level touching the quarterback room, okay? Pat's going to be one of them. Rhett Rodriguez obviously going to be one of them. Travis Trickett's obviously going to be one of them. Of course, Rich is going to be one of them. So a lot of different perspectives helping our quarterbacks see the way, find their way. And boy, I'm jazzed up. I'm excited. I'm fired up. And here we go.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. It's certainly exciting. It kind of continues just what has been a litany here of just exciting news, exciting tidbits, everything from Rich's return to the program, guys like Pat White and Noah Devine being part of that. I mean, our guy Steve Slayton going into the Hall of Fame here recently in the last month or so. Well, his announcement of the fact that he'll be going into the Hall of Fame in the last month or so here, so he's going to have to wait until December until that becomes official at the end of the year. But yeah, just a lot of offseason momentum, a lot of offseason excitement. And like I said, I mean, in terms of attention-grabbing headlines, in terms of notable news, you can't get much more notable than bringing a guy like Pat White back to the program in an official coaching capacity. So pretty stinking cool. And like we said, we're just touching on this as a headline now and making sure, obviously, that we discuss it for a moment. But we will have more with Pat, and we will have more of discussing this with Big O as well.
I'll leave this with something I tweeted a handful of years ago, and it was when Fox Sports put together one of these. Hey, everybody, weigh in. Here's a tweet. Who's your favorite lefty quarterback of all time? Well, I retweeted with the comment. This was in August of 2020. I'll reiterate here again. According to the Population Reference Bureau, the PRB, there have been over 158 billion people, right and left-handed combined, in the history of Earth. Only one of them has been the starting quarterback in 4 college bowl victories, Patrick Christian White. So there you go. College football royalty through and through.
Yeah, absolutely, and excited to have him back. Excited to have him back in Morgantown, and obviously this is something that we will be discussing more this offseason. Don't you worry. Another thank you to our friends at Toothman Ford. We all know cars cost less in Grafton for being a presenting sponsor of everything we do here on ITG. Big shout out to JR and everybody at Team Toothman. Now, Jed, wow, a former Mountaineer legend is on his way back to Morgantown. We've got a few Mountaineers who could be on their way to the National Football League as we transition this thing to our final kind of headline here. We officially know now the Mountaineers that will be in Indianapolis for the Combine. That starts next week, the final week in February. Of course, for those of you who might have joined us, we've picked up a lot of followers, subscribers, new listeners, all those things in the last few months from our Pat White episode and Steve Slayton episode, and I think just the excitement around the program right now. For those of you who might not have been rocking and rolling with us here into year 3 of this podcast, with my day job, I work for the Pittsburgh Steelers and for iHeartRadio, and I go out to the Combine for a week every single year. We've had some pretty cool stuff in the past. With Zach Frazier last year. We had some I'm trying to remember all the different times and everything, but yeah, exactly. And I think before we started this podcast, I had some Letty Brown stuff, even before the ITG days. So always a pretty cool opportunity for me out there, fully credentialed and everything, and on Radio Row that I do with the Steelers, to blend that with some of the content that we get here on ITG. And I'm excited because we have a trio of Mountaineers who will be out in Indianapolis, Jed, and kind of one from each side of the football as well, too, if you will. Wyatt Milam, no surprise here. We talked about how he was Pro Football Focus's in their top 20 ranked players in all of college football last week. He's got a chance to be a first-round draft pick as an offensive lineman. He is going to be at the Combine in Indianapolis. Austin Brinkman as well, too, the long snap specialist. I tell you what, he's got a skill set. He's another one in kind of a long list of successful, talented WVU long snappers here. We've seen Rex Sunahara. It took him some time, but now he's stuck on with an NFL team after working and getting to this point, and finally has carved out a career with the Cleveland Browns. I think Austin Brinkman has a great chance. That's one of those positions, parents, if you want your kids to have a fun career and maybe don't want them to get hit in the head as much, right? Long snapping, great way, low impact potential to have a long and prosperous football and NFL career. So Austin Brinkman going to be able to have a chance to do that in the long snapper department. And then Sean Martin Martin has been invited as a defensive lineman as well, too. Pretty cool for Sean to get that invite. We had hoped that we'd get more than the two. We had speculated if it could happen. Could it be a guy like Garnett Hollis? Could it be a guy like TJ Jackson? Well, Sean Martin ends up being the third Mountaineer to get an invite to the Combine. So like I said, Jed, pretty cool. Each kind of three sides of the ball there. We'll have a Mountaineer representative next week in Indianapolis when the NFL and football world diverges on Indy for a week.
Very cool to have two of the three West Virginia natives, right? Sean Martin representing, Wyatt Milam representing. Boy, Sean's come a long way since he was a freshman. He's always had the frame. He grew into it, but he just turned into a very steady, dependable football player. I think NFL teams are going to like what they see out of him out in Indianapolis. And talking about Austin, dare I say, are we becoming long snapper you? You mentioned Rex. Not a lot of schools can produce a couple within a span of a handful of years. That's pretty irregular because those guys are hard to find. They really are. And Austin strikes me as the type of guy, and maybe Rex is too, that don't look now, but you might be able to make a career for yourself and stick around for double-digit years, 12 years, 15 years, because the shelf life, you're not taking a beating. If you master that skill's there to stay for a long while. And I'd really like to see both of those guys. Like you said, Rex took him a while, but he's stuck now. He's now in the league and seems in a pretty good spot in the league. And I expect the same thing out of Austin. So all three of those guys have different paths that have brought them there and have taken them to Indianapolis. But all three of them have different reasons to be excited about what the future might hold for them. So we look forward to hearing from you on some level. It's always whether or not you have access or what day breaks this way or that way. Okay, on Thursday, I'm going to be here and they're going to be here. So it's all about coordination, but we're eager to get some kind of report from you on site from Indianapolis next week regarding our Mountaineers. There'll be 4 Mountaineers there. You're a Mountaineer, you're a grad, you're an alum. Right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You're absolutely right. I'll be there representing it as always, baby. Yeah. So yeah, it is. It's one of my. Listen, I do this back and forth of like I travel a lot with my job. I spend 3 weeks at Steelers training camp every July and August. If you include the preseason, in regular season, we have 10 road trips minimum. Go on the road for the playoffs this year. Again, that ends up being 11 road trips. So 3 weeks of training camp, 11 road trips throughout the fall. And I get to this point and I'm kind of like, oh man, I just want to be home. I just want to do nothing for a few weeks. But I do always, Indianapolis is one of my favorite cities. I think it's perhaps the most underrated city in this country. It's a fabulous city and it's always a lot of fun as you get kind of the entire football world there at the same time. And so I'll be excited to, try and hunt down some content for us with our Mountaineers.
And it's worth mentioning 3 good football players, but three really good dudes in different ways. I mean, Wyatt's always been a great guy. He's become more vocal last year as a leader in the locker room within that unit up front. Great dude. It's strange to call him a kid, but to me, that's what he is. Sean, soft-spoken, quiet, but in his own way, a really good kind of guy as well. He's a good dude. And Austin, he's the fun one in the group. Austin Brinkman, maybe it's just something about those long snappers. Rex had some of that in him as well. Austin Brinkman's a fun personality, a fun dude to be around. So 3 good football players, 3 good guys. They're easy to cheer for, and I hope and expect big things for them starting in Indianapolis. They already have some postseason opportunities behind them, Senior Bowl opportunities and otherwise. So let's continue to build on that with how they test and what they do between the lines and in the interview settings in Indianapolis. The interview settings, as we talked about before, mean just as much as what you might do from a stopwatch standpoint or a rep standpoint. So a lot of good opportunities, a lot of quality opportunities for 3 quality guys.
Most important job interview of their lives, right? And let's wish for the best for all 3 and hope they crush it out there in Indy next week. Certainly, we have got to get to a break, but when we come back on the other side, the Big Ten, the SEC, flexing their muscle. More substantial changes coming to the college football playoff. What's it mean for the sport? What's it mean for the Big 12 and WVU? We'll discuss all of that and more when we return on the other side. You are in the gun.
For nearly 20 years, Fortis has been the nation's leader in providing guaranteed roof performance programs for commercial buildings. Fortis offers roof performance solutions that feature extensive initial and ongoing reconditioning for commercial buildings as an alternative to traditional replacement with long-term performance guarantees that are backed by global leader Lloyd's of London. Fortis offers a comprehensive range of roof performance management programs that provide financial security, extend the life of our customers' roofs, and make a significant impact on ROI. Fortis is currently improving performance and increasing ROI for customers at more than 4,800 locations, with more than 140 million square feet protected, including many Fortune 500 companies that have turned to Fortis to save money, gain financial certainty, and extend the life of their existing roofs. Fortis has helped customers save more than $520 million in capital roof replacement costs for an average ROI of over 250%. To learn more, visit fortis.us.com. Fortis, roof performance and financial certainty guaranteed.
Nobody supports the blue and gold Mountaineers like Toothman Ford. With over 20 NIL deals and counting, Toothman Ford continues to rally behind our student athletes. And it's time we rally and support the dealer that supports the Mountaineers. Not only does Toothman Ford offer the best prices in the state on pre-owned, their never over MSRP campaign on new Fords guaranteed to save you thousands. Drive with pride all season long, knowing you're supporting the dealer that fuels our Mountaineers. Toothman Ford, where cars cost less, in Grafton and at toothmanford.com.
At Johnston Equipment, you'll find the area's best selection of Coyote tractors and loaders. Stop in and see all our compact equipment with multiple options available, including full cab, diesel, rubber tires, or track loaders. You'll find attachments and implements to get anything done, and low-rate financing options. Johnston Equipment has what you need to get the job done right. Come see the full line today at Johnston Equipment on Route 33 between Weston and Buchanan, or visit johnstoneq.com.
Back in the gun here as we roll along, and some substantial news, more change. Listen, as a college football fan, this is not surprising to you at this point, right? It seems like since about 2019, all this sport has had is significant change year after year after year, and more conference realignment, and the advent of the transfer portal, and the ushering in of the NIL era, and all of these different things, the expansion of BCS system to a college football playoff system from 4 teams now to 12 teams. Well, don't get too comfortable, because we will have more changes inevitably, and it sounds like sooner rather than later, these changes could be pretty substantial and even more landscape altering to the sport that we love so much. So here's what's going on. Starting in 2026, the Big Ten and the SEC are going to control the college football format. Ross Dellinger has reported this. Yahoo Sports, very tapped in football reporter, a trustworthy name. And, basically what has happened is, and Jed can correct me on any of this if I'm wrong, but the SEC and the Big Ten have basically said, we don't like the current 12-team format. We don't like how it played out this first year. I can think you could probably put 2 and 2 together in the, it was so unfair with how Oregon got seated, and we can't believe SMU got in over Alabama, right? Big Ten, SEC have basically said that they don't favor the current format. They matter more than anybody else, and they're going to have their way and do their own thing, and what that is total control, and what that looks like is that the SEC and the Big Ten will hold sole discretion for the future of the college football playoff format starting in 2026, which is the beginning of the college football playoffs' new 6-year television agreement with ESPN that runs through 2031. The agreement grants the league's decision-making powers over the format, but directs them to have meaningful consultation and collect input from other conferences before making their decisions. Pause for joking sound effect. Yeah, I'm sure that they are really going to consider how everybody else feels. They're formulating this idea now, but it would include multiple automatic qualifiers and potentially a 14 or 16 team model. 4 automatic qualifiers to the SEC and the Big Ten, 2 to the ACC and the Big 12, 1 to the highest ranked Group of 5 champion. And then, of course, as always, once again, pause for annoying sound effect. There's a concession in there for Notre Dame because, of course, there has to be for Notre Dame. Jed, I want your initial reactions on this. I know a lot of people, there's been kind of some mass hysteria over this. There's been a lot of people who think that this could actually be good and smart, and multiple automatic qualifiers will benefit everybody. So before you and I get into this, and I'm sure, have some some fired up feelings as two guys who love college football and to a program that is not in the SEC or the Big Ten currently. But just your kind of 30,000-foot initial reaction before we start getting into some of these particulars.
My first thought, Wes, is most people maybe don't recognize that the fuse was lit on this almost a year ago. This was last spring that they call it a memorandum of understanding took place between the power conferences, Notre Dame, all the players were at the table. And you talked about some of the considerations and some of the things that were discussed. Now, you might be asking, even though it took place last spring, why not until 2026? Well, that's because the end of the ESPN TV deal is 2025. So a new TV deal will take place in 2026. That's why these discussions are taking place. Now, you mentioned this already. It's worth repeating because my question is, how enforceable, and I'm using air quotes if you're not watching on YouTube, is this language? The agreement grants the leagues as in Big Ten and SEC, decision-making powers over the format, but directs them to have meaningful consultation and collect input. In other words, play well with others, right? So how enforceable is that? The only thing that I could see in terms of that language having any meaning or bite at all is the media partners might frown on it if you don't. In other words, if the Big Ten and the SEC just step forward, assert themselves, and unilaterally browbeat everyone else from the ACC to the Big Ten on down, that might not necessarily make ESPN as happy as they otherwise would be. So that would be the consideration to me. Now, when you look at the automatic bids, the AQ bids, what they have suggested, whether it's a 14 team or a 16 team, they've suggested 4 auto bids for the SEC, 4 auto bids for the Big Ten. So that bears repeating. 4 and 4. You start the season knowing no matter what anybody does, you automatically have at least 4 teams in this playoff, this 14 or 16 team playoff. Currently, as we mentioned, the 12 team will go into 2025 at least. This change would take place after that, whatever it might look like. Then beyond that, they talked about 2 guaranteed spots for the Big 12, 2 guaranteed spots for the ACC. So let's look at the track data, Wes. You and I have discussed this in passing. We shared this with our group text. So if you look at, take a 16 team, take a 14 team format, since the CFP started in 2014 with the 4 team, what they did was they adjusted for the current structure of the conferences. In other words, Oklahoma counts toward the SEC, Oregon counts toward the Big Ten, et cetera, et cetera. On average, with those adjustments factored in, the Big Ten in a 16-team format would have gotten, since 2014, on average, 5.3 out of 16 teams. The SEC, 5 teams. The Big 12, 2.4. Again, that's without Oklahoma, 2.4. The ACC, 2.1. G5, about a third of a team a year. Notre Dame, 0.63 per year. So 7 times since 2014 for Notre Dame. If you go to a 14 team, the numbers are similar. And I think what they were trying to do to come up, or at least they claim to have done this, to come up with these numbers, is, well, we're looking at the past, and this isn't that far afield from what we've already seen each year. So if we're guaranteeing 4 spots for each of these 2 leagues, that's kind of sort of what they've been getting anyway. 2 spots is kind of sort of what the Big 12 and the ACC have been getting anyway. To me, here's the frustration I have with it. We'll get into some of the other particulars here because there are other considerations that are tied to this as they get set to have meetings. We're going to drop this episode probably on Wednesday. It's on Wednesday, I believe, that the Big 12 or the Big 10 and the SEC will be meeting in New Orleans. And then you're going to have later in the month meetings taking place between all the power brokers to look at probably what has been discussed by the Big 10 and the SEC in New Orleans. On February 25th, those meetings will take place to probably look at some of those things. But the reason you have people getting animated, the reason you have people getting heated, Pat Forty, I listened to their podcast with Ross, who wrote the story, as you mentioned. Pat Forty got pretty animated. He said, basically, this is highway robbery. The same people that want to expand the NCAA basketball tournament to 76 teams, they don't care about anything other than more money and what's best for their league, not what's best for the sport, much less other sports. So that there are plenty of reasons to get upset about this. I think the most basic reason is you already have all the advantages. You already have more resources. You already have more money. You have the best TV and media deals. You already have all the advantages baked in. Why do you need the auto bids? Shouldn't it just fall to form that with all these advantages as your default position, you should get 4 or 5 a year just based on what you can produce on the field with those advantages? So what I don't like is the notion of taking a step beyond that and saying, hey, that's not enough. We want to go to 4 automatic, irrespective of what else plays out. Now, the other things that are being talked about, Wes, because remember, the SEC, and this might bear on a conversation about the West Virginia-Alabama series coming up, twofold, really. Automatic qualifiers is one part of the conversation. The other part of the conversation is the SEC going from 8 conference games, which the Big Ten has 9, just like the Big 12 does. The SEC only has 8. They play the powder puff both up front early in the year and the powder puff in the middle of November, so they don't have a late season loss. Kind of smart on their part, but there's talk of them going from 8 games to 9 like everybody else, 9 conference games. Of course, they'll suffer more losses. Well, right now they care about suffering losses because there's not these 4 automatic bids. But if there's 4 automatic bids, maybe they won't care as much about the losses. So, and then if in fact they go to 9 conference games, the SEC, there's this discussion. The next step would be a TV deal that's separate from everything else that would be inclusive only of the Big Ten and the SEC in the regular season playing each other, crossover games. Now, that is contingent on the SEC going to 9 games, and that is contingent on the automatic qualifiers expanding to like the number 4. Well, because at that point, if you're Alabama, why wouldn't you want to go to Michigan? Who cares? Right. You could lose to Michigan and
we're both going to be in the playoff anyways. Who gives a
Yes, you're automatically the top 4. So who cares? And that's where I get into West Virginia is scheduled here coming up in a couple of years, a home and home, once in Tuscaloosa, once in Morgantown with Alabama. Now, Wes, I've always thought, I was like, if they expand to 9 games, that could be the out that we're looking for to get out of that. Like this year, West Virginia has what we consider to be the ideal non-conference schedule. 1 G5, 1 FCS, 1 P5. Ideally, a rival like Pitt, right? But coming up in a couple of years, we're back to a couple P4 schools on the schedule. It's not ideal. Not a lot of other teams do that. Who do we think we are to try and do it? So if we want to have the model of the G5, FCS, P5 every year, well, some people might say you want to get out of that Alabama game, and maybe you can talk to Pitt about extending the backyard brawl. And it doesn't have to go away beyond after this year until that layoff or hiatus for a handful of years. But then I'm thinking, if I'm the SEC, why would Alabama care? If they get all these things, big deal. You'll play Michigan. You'll play let's say from a non-conference standpoint, you might play Michigan. You might play Kansas State and West Virginia. Who cares if you lose all 3 of them, because all you got to do is finish in the top 4 of your conference. Now, the other part of this, the scheduling partnership between the Big Ten and the SEC is big, because that would be extra money in the pot. We'll double back to that in a second, and let's talk about the rev share impact that could have, that could hurt the non-Big Ten SEC schools. But then finally, there's discussion also tied to this about a reinvented or remade conference championship weekend. Because if, in fact, you start guaranteeing 4 auto bids for the Big Ten and the SEC, or even 2 auto bids for the ACC and the Big 12, the conference championships, which have become more irrelevant by the year as each of these changes take place, well, you're really making them quasi-irrelevant now. So the discussion would be, and this might be one of the only positives out of all this talk, take, for instance, the SEC. Maybe what you do is you say, all right, we're still going to have a conference championship, but not as you know it. Instead, what we're going to do is whoever is number 1 at the end of the regular season, you're automatically in. Maybe even who's number 2, you're automatically in. We get 4 auto bids. So those 2 remaining auto bids, number 3 is going to play number 6 in the SEC. Number 4 is going to play number 5. And you can do the same thing. And even if you have 2 auto bids in the Big 12, if you're number 1, when the smoke clears at the end of the regular season, maybe you make 2 and 3 play for the second auto bid in the Big 12. So that's one of the other possibilities. Okay. But real quick, Wes, let's double back to this Big Ten SEC scheduling partnership that would take place in the regular season. The critical piece to me here is that's additional revenue not attached to anything that's existing in its current form right now. That's money above and beyond what everybody is already making from their TV deals. Now, the Big Ten and the SEC already have far more lucrative TV deals and media rights deals than non-Big Ten, non-SEC schools. The rev share works how? We've talked in previous episodes. It's going to be 22% is the max that you're allowed to spend on your student athletes in all sports at each school. 22% of what? Okay, well, let's discuss that real quick. What they've done is they've taken the average revenue generated by all power conference schools in their athletic department. And it turns out the average is a little over 100 million for all the P4 schools, 60 some odd schools. You take 22% of that figure, which hovers somewhere, depending on who you ask, between 20 and 22 million. It's like 20.5, 20.8. If you are in position, as West Virginia hopes to be, to enjoy the full share, you got to generate that money, first of all, but you are allowed to spend up to that number on all your sports. Mm-hmm. So let's say it's 21 million is a nice round number. Some schools might spend 17 million on football. Some schools might spend 15, but most will be spent on football, second most on men's basketball. Then you'll divide up the rest. Right now, already, Wes, even with that number hovering around, let's say 21 million, there are even Big 12 schools. They're not going to get there.
No.
They're not going to be able to generate enough money to get the full share.
Right.
There will be schools in our conference that don't get to the full rev share. We're fortunate to be among those who hope or aspire to do so. And that's because it's 22% of the 100 and whatever, 103, 104 million, whatever it might be. What did I just say about that Big Ten SEC deal? That's going to add more money to both those conferences, which populate half the P4 the landscape. So now that number is going to go even higher. So now the cap, the 22%, that's 22% of the overall average, is going to get even further inflated. And you already have non-Big Ten and non-SEC schools who can't get to the number as it is. But guess who can get to the number? I promise you, all the Big Ten and all the SEC schools, no problem at all getting to that 22%. So let's say that number goes to 25, 26 million. There's already some Big 12 schools who can't get to the 21 million. You see what I'm saying? That further separates the gap.
Yep.
Before you even get into the additional NIL, which will still exist at those larger blue bloods. So a lot to chew on here, a lot to talk about here. Part of you wants to say, look, at the end of the day, if you're guaranteeing us reasonable access, because I've always argued that's all you want is reasonable access.
Yes. 2
spots in a 14 or 16-team field would on some level seem to be reasonable access.
Yes.
But what vexes me, what troubles me, what doesn't sit well with me, you already have the advantages. Do you really need to box everyone out by guaranteeing yourselves 8 out of 14 or 8 out of 16 teams guaranteed with all your pre-existing baked-in advantages on top of it? So some people have said, because the Big Ten and the SEC have threatened, look, you either go along and come along, or we're going to break off and go do our own thing. That's what we're going to do. And good luck trying to exist without us. We're going to go do our own thing. We're going to
being
take
the biggest
our
villain in the history, being the biggest villain in the history of sports, because you break up college football and what it was for 150 years.
Oh, you talk about a dark cape and a Darth Vader helmet. They would be a super villain. See, here's what I think they would do in addition to that, because media partners would want more inventory. That's the other thing. If you take the 14 or 16 team format, which I'm not averse to an expanded playoff. I was not averse to the 4 going to 12. And don't give me this nonsense about first round blowouts. Look, it's going to take some time to equalize and stabilize.
It's 1 year.
Before
1 year so far.
Recruiting balances out, portal acquisitions balance out. Once players start to recognize, look, there are now 25 to 30 teams with an opportunity to play on the biggest stage, whereas before there were 5 or 6. Things will equalize a little more than they did this previous year, right? And meanwhile, one of the biggest blowouts was the number 1 seed, Oregon. So don't give me this nonsense about these lopsided games.
Right.
Look, so if you expand those, which there were already, we were trying to find valuable TV slots against the NFL on Saturday games for the NFL. So now what you'd be trying to do is adding games to that opening round when it was already a logjam. Again, I'm not against it. I'm sure there are, if the money's right, there are ways to overcome these problems with the additional inventory. But that could be the final thing that the SEC and Big Ten do. Let's say that they're not balking or bluffing. Let's say that they're being serious. And if you don't cooperate, they're just going to take off and leave everybody else behind and go do their own thing. I think what they would do on the way out, they would extend invites, and this would be to satisfy or appease their media partners who want more inventory. Hey, West Virginia, hey, Oklahoma State, hey, whoever, probably half of the ACC and half of the Big 12 or more. Hey, you want to come on and be part of this too? And we'll really leave everybody behind.
Yeah.
We will really leave everybody behind. So then it's almost like who's left to genuinely
where do you draw
be
that?
upset?
Where do you draw that line of demarcation? Right, Northwestern. Sorry, buddy, you're the cutoff.
And that's what you and I were talking about before we came on the air, Wes. We said, okay, you have to get into the portion of the conversation that involves relegation, because for those who don't know, relegation, I guess the European soccer leagues.
You want me to? I'll give you the quick. I'll give you the quick rundown
give us,
of it. Okay,
give us the drive out on that.
At the top of English soccer and Spanish soccer and German soccer and French soccer, right? There's 20 teams in the top league of each of those countries. Portugal, Netherlands, all these countries that have their own leagues. 20 teams in the top league, and then there's leagues underneath that. So 20 teams in the second league, 20 teams in the third, and sometimes it's 24, 26, something like that. But just to give you a rough estimation, every year the worst 3 teams in the top leagues go down. So if you're one of the worst 3 teams in the top league, you go down to League 2. If you're one of the worst 3 teams in League 2, you go down to League 3, and so on. The top 3 teams get promoted. So if you're one of the best three teams in League 3, congratulations. Next year you're playing up in League 2. If you're one of the top 3 teams in League 2, congratulations. You're up in the big leagues playing with the big boys next year. It's called promotion and relegation, and it adds an obviously incredible layer of intrigue, because all of a sudden, say at the end of the year, and money, no doubt, because you're still selling tickets, you're still getting eyeballs. At the end of the year, if you've got 3-win Kansas and 2-win Oklahoma State, and one gets to stay in the Big 12 and one's getting sent down to the G5, that obviously becomes a massive game. Whereas in any other year, Kansas versus Oklahoma State, 3-win team, 2-win team at the end of the season, who cares?
Think about what you're leaving out. What G5 team would take their place?
Correct.
Right?
And then Tulane and Marshall and James Madison are ready to jump up. Yes, that's promotion and relegation in a nutshell for you.
Thank you. And that's what some have suggested could satisfy the consideration or the complaint that you can't leave the little guy behind entirely. Some level of access is necessary. And some people say they dismiss relegation in college football out of hand. Well, let me ask you this. How many other things would you have dismissed out of hand in the last decade or two that now are mainstream and everyday life?
A dozen automatic qualifiers into a college football playoff.
So the reason I agree with Rick Neuheisel, the reason you can't roll anything like this out is because of the gold bars and wads of cash that could be attached and that could be generated by this. So as long as that possibility exists, you might see things like this. Now, there is talk of congressional involvement, whether you like it or not. I think at some point, Congress is going to need to get involved. And you probably need some sort of carve out, Wes, before you would see relegation. I mean, how does Greg Sankey go to Vanderbilt and say, hey, bad news, I know you enjoy cashing those $80 million checks from the SEC and not doing anything to reinvest in your facilities or your programs, and your football is stagnant. You don't like to reinvest and put anything in it. Meanwhile, West Virginia and Louisville are battling for their lives and trying to overachieve. I know you enjoy these big fat checks we give you and don't really do anything with that money to help your football team. That might not go on for much longer unless you get your act straight because of relegation. I don't think you can do that with some sort of congressional carve out, or at least a limited antitrust exemption, because the NCAA is very limited in what they can or can't do. Basically, if you're a fan and you're not knee deep in this the way we are, and you're like, why don't we just do X, Y, or Z? I got a great idea. Why don't we just do this? And that would solve all the problems. The answer is probably because of antitrust. And the NCAA is scared to death to get sued again after the Supreme Court ruled in the Alston case 9-0, clearly and with extreme prejudice against them. Don't you dare even consider anything like that again. So without at least on a limited basis, some sort of antitrust exemption to allow them to do business, because without that type of thing, I don't quite frankly see anything like this being possible. The NCAA lives in sheer terror of the players becoming employees. That's at all costs what they want to avoid, because if that happens, they don't exist. So they are trying to find protection against that as a possibility. They're trying to find protection against antitrust, getting slapped with those penalties. They want some level of protection. And the only way this could happen is if Congress on some level gets involved, because even from an NIL standpoint, when you look at name, image, likeness, there are 30 some odd different state laws hovering out there. California might be different than West Virginia and Delaware and Florida. So there's no uniform approach or uniform application of how NIL should or shouldn't work unless Congress gets involved and there are federal statutes that say, here's how NIL works. We don't care what state you're in. This is what applies. So you need some element of uniformity. And there were a lot of people thinking that, okay, after the election, this might get more amped up, because that's the type of thing that you might see the NCAA. Remember, Charlie Baker, former politician himself, head of the NCAA. So these are the angles that he's been working for quite some time. But there are a lot of things to talk about, from the Big Ten, the SEC. Yes, they have all the power. Yes, they have all the chips. You have the TV partners. You have the NCAA, because the NCAA has been completely and utterly defanged as an organization, as a governing body. I mean, they are terrified to do anything because of antitrust. So without further changes, I mean, there are cases in play right now, Wes, where the players and the athletes are trying to unionize and organize. I mean, that's in the courts right now. Mm-hmm. So there are so many moving parts here that let's see where all this settles. But once again, the reason these discussions are taking place now, even though they were agreed upon initially last spring, the TV deals toll with ESPN, with these conferences at the end of 2025, at the end of the 2025 CFP. And it will start anew from 2026 to 2031 after that. So that's why you're hearing these things. These meetings are taking place as we speak. I think there's going to be significant change afoot. What that might look like, it's kind of scary. You don't really know. But the SEC and the Big Ten, look, they're not going to act in the best interest of the sport at large. They're going to act in the best interest of their leagues. They're going to do what's best for them. And only if they see bigger dollars by involving more inventory, and only if that's what it takes to, satisfy their media partners. I don't think it's as simple as 15 to 18 teams in each of the Big Ten and the SEC carving out their own enterprise and jumping off and doing that. I think it's going to be more complicated. There's going to be more crossover than that. Think you're going to see, by the time the dust settles, whether that's 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, it's going to be some form of a bunch of other teams out of the Power Four structure beyond the Big Ten and the SEC before it finally settles into something. Because what ends up happening is the fly in the ointment. The NFL has a couple things right, but the college football is greater than the NFL in several ways as well. But what the NFL has right is there's no element of Olympic figure skating in the NFL postseason. It's very structured. There's like 32 teams. If you finish here, here's the tiebreaker. What's your record against conference play, divisional play, et cetera, et cetera. So on down the line, it's clearly identified and clearly defined where you finish, where you place. Just imagine.
There's no subjective opinion on who gets into the play.
Can you imagine if there was a committee
any sport, Jed,
deciding seeding?
Forget the NFL. In any sport, there's no in this country, there's no subjective committee that decides the playoff except for college football. We don't go, well, look at the NFC North this year. I mean, the Lions won 15 games and the Vikings won 14 games and the Packers won.
Imagine?
The NFC North should get 2 automatic qualifiers in. What a great conference.
What if there was a committee deciding where Patrick Mahomes is seated? Can you imagine the backlash
and Jed,
on that?
That's the part that gets me, because what you said, the whole reasonable access thing, like, I'm not unreasonable. I realize that the Big Ten and the SEC are the two best conferences. So that breakdown in a vacuum, I don't think is unreasonable. But the big picture of all of it is so anti-competitive. Like, where else do we say this division gets 2 automatic qualifiers, but this only gets 1? Do we do that in March Madness? Do we go, well, you know what? The SEC hasn't won a national championship in basketball since Kentucky 13 years ago. The Big Ten hasn't won a national championship in basketball in March Madness since Michigan State 25 years ago. Meanwhile, look at all the natties that the Big 12 is winning. Look at all the natties that the ACC is winning. You know what? The ACC and the Big 12 need at least guaranteed 8 teams in March Madness every single year. Where else do we do this? For so long, Jed, and you've touched on this many times before, because this is part of an ongoing topic of the changing landscape of college football that we've discussed throughout the 3-year course of this podcast many times. Like, just come out then and tell me that the record doesn't matter. Like, that's what this is all getting to. The record doesn't matter. All that matters is who we perceive as the best teams, because, like, Jed, we know that this is all just a knee-jerk reaction to, I can't believe Arizona State got a bye. I can't believe, Boise State got a bye. I can't believe SMU.
Which I'll agree. They shouldn't have.
No, I agree with that too. I think the bye format was. I think the bye format was completely wrong. But like, this is all such a knee-jerk reaction to, oh my gosh, look what Arizona State and Boise State got a bye, and oh my gosh, look, SMU got into the playoff over Alabama off a 1-year sample size. And
you mentioned
the final. One more thing, just real quick, Jed, is like the last kicker to me of all of this is there's way more programs like Boise State and like Arizona State and like SMU than there are programs like Ohio State and Georgia. I mean,
those are the blue bloods.
There's way more WVU in Louisville, in Virginia Tech, in Pitt, in Kansas State, in Texas Tech, in Maryland than there are Notre Dame and LSU. And so what happens, and it's already started over the last 5 or so years, but what happens when you lose all those fan bases? What happens when you tell those fan bases you don't get to sit at the same table as everybody else, but we still want you to pay thousands of dollars a year in apparel and travel and tickets and donations, but you're not really getting to play with the big boys. It's not going to work. Like the illusion that the Cleveland Browns fans and the New York Jets fans get to experience the same thing as the Ravens fans and the Eagles fans, it's still there. Even though it might not play out in reality every single season, the system is still there. The system in this tells the fan bases at 80%, 85% of the programs in this sport, you don't matter. And, buddy, that's a dangerous game to play, because eventually they're going to start acting like they don't matter, and there goes hundreds of thousands of eyeballs.
You know what this reminds me of, Wes? It reminds me of when I was growing up, and this dates me, back through the 80s into the early 90s. It finally ended when the Broncos upset the Packers in the Super Bowl. The NFC had an absolute, unmitigated death grip.
Now, Cowboys, the AFC had it in the 70s. Niners and Packers.
Okay? The AFC had it in the 70s, but not to the extent that the NFC, they just dominated the Super Bowl. And you kind of knew, but you tricked yourself in. That was when the Bills lost 4 in a row. That, some good Broncos teams when they got knocked around. It would have almost been like the NFL saying, you know what? The AFC doesn't deserve a team. Let's just have 2 NFC teams play for the Super Bowl. Even though we've structured everything this way, the AFC really doesn't deserve one. The NFC is clearly better, because here's what frustrates me. You mentioned men's basketball, the NCAA March Madness postseason tournament. Okay, where else do you do that? Well, you don't. You have everybody in the 64 somehow, some way gets in there based on
there's only one automatic qualifier per. There's one way to get in automatically, that's to win your conference. The same way it's been in college sports for 150 years. Win your conference.
I'm not against seeding done by a committee. Here's what I say: you can't. There are when you have you're talking about an enterprise in college football with 130 teams. So there is no easy or manageable way to make it like the NFL. Nor do I want to. I just like the clean-cut nature of defining your champion in the NFL. I don't care if a 9-7 team wins the Super Bowl. If they get hot at the right time and win 4 straight games against the 4 best teams on the planet Earth, they should. Okay? I don't really care. But at the end of the day, I don't mind a committee deciding seating. So here's where I come down on this. I understand you can't go from 130 teams and do what the NFL does in 32. And again, I don't want to. I don't have ambitions of doing that. But what I do want is to, if you expand the number enough, which 12 teams is getting there, 14 or 16, maybe that's a sweet spot, whatever, it's better than 2. Because when we were at 2 teams, it clearly was Olympic figure skating. Mm-hmm. What did the East Russian judge say? Mm-hmm. Period. Or the Russian judge or the East German judge. It was entirely Olympic figure skating. Human discretion with all the faults therein.
You had undefeated teams. Undefeated teams got left out of national championship.
Yes, they did.
Conversations.
So how do you you're going to have some element of human involvement in committees because we have 130 teams. But what can you do to marginalize the errors and flaws of that? What you do is you expand it to 12, 14, 16 teams. And then I agree, let the humans decide the seeds, because last year that's what was screwed up, the seeding. I mean, Boise shouldn't have been getting a bye. I mean, come on. They shouldn't have got a bye with the 4 seed. If you want to seed it differently, I'm entirely fine with that. But what I'm not entirely fine with are these irksome conversations that, as Indiana, say what you want about their schedule, they played their way through the Big Ten. Through the Big Ten.
Big Ten.
Yes, It was a soft Big Ten schedule, but it was a Big Ten schedule nevertheless. Period. Okay? And you had teams like when the argument was, well, how can Indiana be going? And meanwhile, Alabama's sitting home. Are you telling me, look at Alabama's recruiting class? Are you telling me that Indiana's better than Alabama?
So tell me records don't matter.
What does that have to do with it? You want to look at Kentucky's recruiting class versus Indiana's? Who do you think clearly had a better recruiting class?
You want to look at Florida's recruiting class versus Indiana's?
And stick to Kentucky for a second. There are many examples. Are you going to tell me that Kentucky's going to go out there last year with Indiana playing the level of football in October and November they were? Yeah, I knew who I'm taking in that game. Now, anything can happen on any given day, but Indiana was playing better football than Kentucky. Recruiting class be damned. So what you do on the field should absolutely matter, but I'm not naive enough to say that everything can be decided on the field because we have 130 teams.
Sure.
So what can you do to satisfy both ends of all this? And I think the answer on some level might be, first of all, you already have the advantages that we enumerated earlier in the show, if you're the SEC and the Big Ten. Do you really need to start the season by saying, by hook or by crook, we got 4 teams in? We don't care. We don't care what that means. We don't care what that means. And you know what? If you want to play your way in with 2 teams, I might be fine with that. What's wrong with having a bunch of at-large and let a committee decide that? I'll entertain that argument.
Well, what's wrong with that, Jed?
Less like figure skating in the Olympics.
You and I are completely aligned, but what's wrong with that to them is that at times, not every year, but SMU is going to get in over Alabama. Iowa State's going to get in over Oregon or USC or something like that at some point, and we can't have that. That's why we made these. We didn't think about this when we made all these super conferences. We just grabbed everybody up and completely altered a 150-year sport overnight. And now we want to continue to do that by taking its postseason and doing something that we don't do in any other sports league in this country or across the world.
No, we don't. Everything's decided on the field, on the court, on the ice.
To use one more
in college football.
To use one more example for you, Jed, as we wrap this thing up, because you had me bring in the promotion relegation system, and I do hesitate to use the European soccer advantages or examples, because I know when I bring that up, 97% of you automatically tune me out. But I promise this is valid, and it'll be very quick. 3 years ago, off the back of COVID, right, when revenues were down across sports leagues all over the world because there were no fans or a fraction of fans going to games. The biggest leagues in Europe, I mentioned to you, right? There's a league in Spain, in England, in France, in Germany, in Italy. All these countries have their own top-level soccer leagues. Every year, the best 3 teams from each country compete for the European Championship. Okay, it's called the Champions League. It is the Super Bowl, if you will, of European soccer. So at the end of the season, you qualify. The teams who finish top 3 in England, top 3 in Spain, top 3 in Germany, top 3 in Italy go into this. I think it's 32 teams or something like that across from Europe, 16 teams across from Europe, and they play and they determine the champion of Europe for the Champions League. It is, like I said, it's Europe's version of the Super Bowl. Off the back of COVID, all these leagues and the biggest teams in the league, they tried to change the format that the biggest teams would get in every year. So the Champions League would no longer be based on merit and who finished first in their league, but every year it would be Manchester United and Manchester City and Liverpool and Barcelona and Spain and Bayern Munich and Paris. It would be the biggest brands in there every year. And you know what happened, Jed?
Crashed and burned.
It never even took off the ground because the fans of the big clubs revolted. They said, hell no, this is not our sport. This is not what we do. This is anti-competitive. We don't stick your private equity and all your money up your backside. We don't care. That's not what we're doing. Fans literally broke into their own stadiums to protest this. The fans of the teams that would have benefited from it. Unless the Big Ten and the SEC, I don't see a bunch of people from Alabama and Ohio raising a stink about this when they know it's going to benefit their programs. But that would go a long way if they did. They're not going to, but it would go a long way if Ryan Day came out and said this is a bunch of hogwash. It would go a long way if Kirby Smart came out and said this is a bunch of hogwash. But that ain't going to happen because dollar bills, y'all.
That's exactly right, and that's why there's no going back. We're never going back. So for those listening saying, why don't we go back to that? There's no going back because of the money, period. That's how it is. Because of the litigation, the courts have been clear. Everything is headed in a certain direction. So now the question becomes, how can you most appropriately navigate that and salvage something that we still appreciate and enjoy? That's what it comes down to. And what always drove me crazy was I enjoy, but I don't covet. I enjoy the sanctity of the regular season, but I think it's over coveted, to be honest with you, because nothing drove me crazier is, hey, if you don't want to, then just don't lose in the regular season. Oh, unless you're team X, Y, or Z, and then it's fine. That's what always drove me crazy. Quit acting like nobody can lose in the regular season. Some teams are just flat out allowed, period. Not because of who they beat, but because of what's on their helmet. So don't tell me that. Nothing drove me crazier back in the midst of these most heated debates that people were having about the changes afoot with college football.
Agreed.
Well, we don't need a playoff. Just don't lose that game in October. Yeah, unless you're Alabama or Auburn, then it's just fine. Not because of who you beat outside of that. It's just because of what's on your helmet. It's just fine.
Right. And
but
your
for West
recruiting
Virginia,
class.
you better not lose that. You better not lose that game that those Blue Bloods lost. That's what drove me crazy. None of that was equal. That's on the field. Things on the field on some level should be equal. So let's create a situation or a scenario or a dynamic in which, as much without being excessive, like I think that when you think back to Mike Leach was an outside the box thinker. May he rest in peace. He had a lot of good ideas, but a lot of crazy ideas. I think the 64-team playoff to match or to mirror what college basketball does was excessive. That's too much. That's too much football. You can't play 5 or 6 regular season games and start your postseason. I think we're in the ballpark. We're approaching or somewhere around the sweet spot. The 12 to 16. Now, just how do you manage the 12 or 16? Quit trying to box others out. And nothing to me is a bigger slap in the face than saying, you know what, we got twice as much money as you. We have twice as many advantages as you as a Big Ten or SEC member. But that's still not enough. We want to guarantee that before we put on pads in August, we've got 4 automatic teams no matter what. That is as insulting as it comes. So that's what troubles me. That's an absolute slap in the face to the sport. Like you said, I get it. They're the 800-pound gorillas. There's 2 of them.
Yeah,
I understand.
No denying that.
I perfectly understand. But at the same time, the whole country doesn't want to sit. There's a reason that the LSU-Alabama game was one of the most poorly viewed national championship games in recent memory. Nobody cared. It was 2 SEC teams playing the same style of football, and only SEC, dyed-in-the-wool SEC fans even cared outside of Alabama and LSU fans. Nobody watched it. You don't want a sport at large that is inflicted with that same problem. Mm-hmm. What you want is a sport that reaches and touches and interests as many as possible. Some level of parity needs to exist. Again, it's not going to exist to the level the NFL does. And that's what the NFL has gotten right. That's why the NFL is the most powerful brand in the history of the United States of America. It drives me crazy also. Why would you want to be like that? Well, yeah, okay. Why would you want to be like the most powerful brand in the history? You can be like that, but be different too. In other words, understand and appreciate what they've got right, but do your own version of it. Still be college football, or at least to the extent you can. Look, the game that we used to know, how many times on this show have we said it? We coined the phrase college football 1.0, college football 2.0. This is college football 2.0. Unless you can build me a time machine, college football 1.0 ain't never coming back. Period. Period. Would Steve Slayton have stayed after the Sugar Bowl in college football 2.0? I don't know. Would Major Harris have stayed after his freshman year in college football 2.0? I don't know. I don't have the answers to any of that. This is a new sport. The old sport is gone forever. As much as we loved it, as much as we cherished it, it's gone forever and it's not coming back. How can we make the most out of this new sport? And some people, quite frankly, are going to get checked out. They're going to be fed up with it. They're not going to be, they'll never be as passionate about it. Some people just won't be. But obviously, enough people will to drive the bottom line, which is the dollar, to dictate a lot of these decisions, which is why a lot of these decisions are being made. They're not making these decisions because they don't see revenue at the end of the tunnel. They're making them because they do. So how can we keep it as interesting as possible? Like you said, and that's a great point. There are only, depending on how you define blue blood, anywhere from 6 to 15 blue bloods, period. Everybody else is in the same stratosphere as West Virginia and Mississippi State and Maryland and Kansas State.
Cincinnati.
Everybody else is like that. Cincinnati, whoever it might be, okay? Everybody else is that. So that's the vast, overwhelming majority of the fan bases and the programs that populate this wonderful, awesome sport. So why would you want to alienate the overwhelming majority of anything when you're trying to maximize what an enterprise can be? And I don't think at the end of the day, they will, because they'll see the dollars that are attached to that as well. So yes, you could break off and go do your own thing. I'm not sure that's maximizing the revenue, which is why I'm not sure they'd do it. Otherwise, they would do it. They won't do it because they're virtuous. They're not going to do anything because they're virtuous. Whatever they do is going to be driven by trying to maximize the dollar. And that might, in fact, involve the inventory that would include the West Virginias and so on. But this is something here. Part of me looked at it and I said, well, reasonable access, 2 out of 16. That's reasonable. But you know what? You got greedy. You pushed. And you made me look at that and say, really? Yep. So I'm going to be looking at a scenario where you might have a 6th place SEC team playing for a playoff bid on championship weekend. Maybe. I don't know. I just don't like the automatic part of it. I don't like the automatic part of it. I'm sorry. At least to that extent.
Where else?
At least to that extent.
Where else in this country do we do that for any other sport? Where it's more than one. In every sport, NFL, baseball, hockey, NBA, college basketball, college soccer, college baseball. Winning your conference is the one way to get an automatic qualifier. Everything else is done based off of a committee or a tiebreaker or some type of system.
What did we hear the entire NFL postseason? What did we hear? It was nonstop, okay? It was the world against the Chiefs, the world against Mahomes, the world against Kelsey, the world against Taylor Swift. People were fed up and tired. There's a lot of Kansas City Chiefs fatigue, period. All this about the officials calling the games for the Chiefs and throwing the games for the Chiefs. It was nonstop. Can you imagine if, and that's a situation where everything is 100% played out on the field. Can you imagine if you have some committee announcing on announcement, weekend before the NFL playoffs start, Kansas City, the number 1 seed in the AFC, because we deem that way, not because of what they did. Can you imagine the outcry that would, and some people might be listening to this and say, oh, that'd be great. That's what people want. They want that kind of controversy and argument. Look, I appreciate controversy. I appreciate debate. I appreciate arguments, but not as much as I appreciate football games on the field. I want both, and I want the debate taking a backseat to football on the field. I want the debate to still be there, and it always will, but taking a clear backseat to the football on the field.
Jed, the next time that there's like a 9-8 division like the Colts win their division at 9-8 or something, and then you've got a a 13-win Baltimore team that ends up coming second in their division. Well, no, sorry, Colts. Actually, even though you won your division, you're supposed to host the playoff game. You're gonna have to go to Baltimore
7-9
because they're better than you. I mean, forget those 7-9 Seahawks that everyone said should have been in the playoffs, and then went and beat the defending champion New Orleans Saints as a 7-9 team. Actually, the Seahawks should have just had to stay at home because who cares if they won their division? They were 7-9.
Plus the 7-9 team years ago. I remember the 8-8 Browns winning the AFC Central way back when, but there was a 7-9 NFL team that I think hosted a game.
Yes, the Seahawks did. And they won.
They defined.
They beat the defending champion Saints. It was the beast. It was the Marshawn Lynch beastquake when he had that famous run. That was a 7-9 Seahawks team that was hosting the defending Super Bowl champion Saints that were the favorite to go back again. And everyone was like, "This is a joke. How does Seattle get to host a game at 7-9?" Until they beat New Orleans.
And you know what? The rules are clearly defined before the game. And what happened to the Seahawks after that? They didn't go on some run. It caught up to them. And
but then they did go on some run, as and went to back-to-back Super Bowls. But it's you can't. What I'm saying in that is you can't change the parameters on the fly just because in one singular year it didn't play out the way that might not have been fair, And so just because it wasn't fair that Boise State got a bye, some of these things weren't fair. But that's why you tweak. That's why you tweak the system. You don't completely nuke it and give yourself all the advantages that you already have. I think we're on the same page on that one.
I think that's exactly right. I think we've covered. And the other part of it is, look, be careful of who you listen to and who you don't, because everybody on some level is going to have an agenda. Why wouldn't they? Like, for instance, you know who wants expansion on any level? They would take a 64 team playoff. You know who wants it? The coaches.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because they have postseason bonuses, they have job security. All those things are so. Look, on some level, reasonable heads need to prevail. Yes, I understand you're going to chase the almighty dollar. That's going to be the only true north that keeps you honest in all this. But what we're saying is we feel the almighty dollar is going to look a little bit differently in the grand scheme of things in terms of how you maximize that than what some of these, at least prematurely, these ideas being bandied about might look like. So be careful of how you approach it. It's a whole new game. 1.0 is never coming back. We're all on board with that. It's clear. Wes and I understand 2.0 is here to stay unless 3.0 is around the corner, and it might be. The Big Ten and the SEC are firmly entrenched as the power brokers in all this. We get all that. But at the end of the day, what we're saying is, even if the SEC and the Big Ten truly want to act in their own best interests, think this through in terms of all these considerations, what this might look like. I don't know about this 4-team. That's going to sour a lot of people when you're trying to get as many eyeballs on the TVs with as many captivating games as this thing winds down and works its way through round 1, round 2, onto the championship, et cetera. So that's what it's going to look like. This is something we'll be talking about a lot all the way through. This isn't going to go away. This is going to be an ongoing conversation, and there's going to be plenty of this to talk about. We'll be more than tired of it. We already are, because it's been going on for a number of years already. But yeah, so.
Some final thank yous to our friends at Fortis, our buddy Rick Lewis for roof performance and financial certainty guaranteed. You got to visit fortis.us.com. And a thank you to Johnston Equipment, for being a presenting sponsor of ITG. You can get 0% financing for 72 months plus a free loader on select Coyote models in stock. Visit Johnston Equipment on Route 33 between Weston and Buchanan. Yeah, this isn't going anywhere. We will continue, obviously, despite the fatigue, to discuss this. And obviously, as well, too, there's no right or wrong answer in all of this. Some people might love this and think that this is the right thing to do. Some people might be complete vitriol and hate it, and I'm done with college football if this happens. Maybe you're kind of like Jed and I, somewhere in the middle. You know the drill. Let us know in the comments, and maybe we'll get to some of those in a future episode when we revisit some of these things. But for now, that will go ahead, Jed. You all right? You good?
I need to go back and look. I did an episode last year on what I considered an answer to this. Okay. And in my format, I did give the SEC and the Big Ten more autos than we had, but it wasn't to that extent. You see what I'm saying?
Maybe three versus 2 instead of 4 versus 2.
I need to look at that. It's just some of this seems excessive. That's all.
I think
when you're showing up, it's almost like, look, why don't you have NFL scouts go to each training camp around the country and decide who's going to the playoffs? Why don't you just do that? Hey, they got more talent than anybody else. Here's our 16 most talented teams going into the season. There, have them play for the playoffs. Why don't you just do that? Just do that, right?
Well,
yeah,
I mean,
play on the field.
Good thing, Jed, right? There was no reason for the Washington Commanders to be in the postseason this year. I mean, look at how bad that they've been.
Not at all.
They weren't going to do anything.
Yeah.
They weren't going to do anything.
No, of course. Yeah. So.
Oh, wait, they were in the NFC Championship game? Oh, wow.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
Yeah,
that
and almost more. Yeah.
That will, and you know what's funny about that too? At the beginning of the season, the Eagles were 2-2, and everyone wanted to fire Sirianni and get rid of Jalen Hurts and blow the whole thing up. And now they're Super Bowl champions and one of the more impressive runs, I think, in recent memory. But that will do it for this edition of ITG. You know where to get at us in the comments if you want to get involved. For Skylar Callahan, our producer, and the beer truck Big O, he's the signal caller, Jed Drenning. I'm Wes Schuler. The one thing we ask of you is to be an ear and tell an ear about your new favorite WVU football podcast. Take care, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. You've been in the gun.
ITG.
The fun doesn't have to stop here.
Be sure to hit subscribe and never miss an episode.
If you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback,
be sure to follow us on X at In the Gun Podcast.
Join us again next time.
Until then,
tell an ear to tell an ear about your new favorite WVU football podcast.
This mission is over. It's over.